Fentanyl is the leading cause of death for Americans between the ages of 18 and 45. In 2024, roughly 75,000 Americans died of overdoses. The treatments that exist, methadone and buprenorphine, are opioid replacements. They manage the addiction. They do not end it. After a year on standard treatment, roughly 60 to 80% of patients relapse. Texas just bet $100 million on something different, something that grows on a shrub in West Africa, something that is, right now, a Schedule I controlled substance in the United States, something that, in a single dose, may interrupt opioid addiction in a way no pharmaceutical has ever achieved. This is Ibogaine, and in the last 12 months, it has gone from underground clinics in Mexico to a presidential executive order to the FDA. Welcome to Psychedelics University. Ibogaine is derived from the root bark of a West African shrub called Tabernanthe iboga. Indigenous communities in Gabon have used iboga in spiritual ceremonies for centuries. In the 1960s, a heroin addict named Howard Lotsoff took Ibogaine and noticed something remarkable. His withdrawal symptoms stopped. His craving for heroin seemed to disappear. He spent the rest of his life trying to get scientists to pay attention. The mechanism is genuinely unusual. Most addiction treatments work on a single receptor pathway. Ibogaine works on several at once. It modulates NMDA receptors, involved in memory reconsolidation. It acts on kappa opioid receptors, which regulate the brain's stress response. It resets dopamine transporter function, which governs the reward circuits that addiction hijacks. And it triggers neuroplasticity in ways that may explain why the effects persist long after the drug clears the body. A single treatment lasts 18 to 36 hours. Patients describe it as a dreamlike, visionary state, followed by profound calm. This is not a pill you take and go to work. It is a full neurological event. A small-scale study cited in Michigan legislative testimony found 75% one-year abstinence rates after a single Ibogaine treatment. Compare that to the 20 to 40% abstinence rates on standard opioid use disorder medications. The numbers are not comparable. The question has never been whether Ibogaine works. The question has always been whether it is safe enough to use.
The safety answer began to crystallize in 2024 with a study published in Nature Medicine. Neurologist Nolan Williams and his team at Stanford worked with 30 special operations veterans, men and women with traumatic brain injury, PTSD, and co-occurring opioid use disorder. They had cycled through every available treatment. Almost none had found lasting relief. Williams used a protocol that addressed Ibogaine's primary danger directly. Ibogaine's main risk is cardiac. It can prolong the QT interval, the electrical recovery period between heartbeats. In unscreened patients, this prolongation can trigger fatal arrhythmias. Real deaths have occurred. This is not a theoretical risk. It is the reason Ibogaine has remained Schedule I. Williams solved this by co-administering intravenous magnesium alongside the Ibogaine. Magnesium stabilizes the cardiac membrane and significantly offsets the QT prolongation risk. The protocol also required full cardiac screening and EKG monitoring before any patient received the compound. The results at 1-month follow-up: 88% reduction in PTSD symptoms, 87% reduction in depression, 81% reduction in anxiety. 86% of participants no longer met diagnostic criteria for PTSD at all. 2 follow-up studies reinforced the findings. A 2025 paper in Nature Mental Health showed measurable brain oscillation changes by EEG consistent with neuroplastic reorganization. A 2026 paper in Biological Psychiatry found increased cerebral blood flow in the anterior cingulate cortex and the left insula, regions tied to emotional regulation, a full month after a single treatment. The protocol demonstrated that with proper screening and monitoring, the cardiac risk is manageable. That finding changed the political calculation. Ibogaine was no longer just a compound someone might take in a jungle. It was a protocol that could be standardized, tested, and administered in a real clinical setting. Texas was paying attention.
In June of 2025, Governor Greg Abbott signed Senate Bill 2308 into law. The bill created a $100 million Ibogaine research program, $50 million in state appropriations matched dollar for dollar by required outside investment. UT Health Houston, in collaboration with UTMB Health, was named to administer the program. Targets included opioid use disorder, PTSD, and traumatic brain injury, with an explicit focus on veterans. This is the largest publicly funded psychedelic research initiative in United States history. The political story behind the bill is worth understanding because it explains why this happened in Texas before anywhere else. A man named Bryan Hubbard, who had previously worked in a federal opioid policy role before being forced to resign, pivoted to Ibogaine advocacy. He co-founded an organization called Americans for Ibogaine alongside Rick Perry, the former Texas governor and former U.S. Secretary of Energy. Perry had personal exposure to veterans dealing with PTSD and addiction, and he became one of the most effective bipartisan voices for Ibogaine reform in any state legislature. The combination of a Republican governor, a Republican former governor, and a genuine veterans crisis made the legislative pathway in Texas unlike anything the psychedelic reform movement had achieved before. Texas was not alone for long. Mississippi signed House Bill 314 in March 2026, directing $5 million from opioid settlement funds toward Ibogaine research and requiring coordination with the Texas Consortium. Michigan is moving a similar bill. The pattern is a multi-state architecture with Texas as the anchor and other states layering on. Then came Washington.
On April 18, 2026, President Trump signed Executive Order 14401, titled Accelerating Medical Treatments for Serious Mental Illness. The order directed $50 million in federal funds through ARPA-H and the Department of Health and Human Services to match state psychedelic research programs. It specifically highlighted Ibogaine for veterans, addiction, and PTSD. It also invoked the Right to Try Act as a potential pathway for Ibogaine compound access before formal FDA approval. 6 days later, on April 24, 2026, the FDA cleared an investigational new drug application for DemeRx 1001. This is a nor-ibogaine derivative developed by a company called DemeRx. Nor-ibogaine is the primary metabolite that ibogaine converts to in the body, and DemeRx's thesis is that it may offer a cleaner safety profile while retaining the therapeutic effect. This was the first ever U.S. clinical trial clearance for an ibogaine derivative. The initial trial focuses on alcohol interaction, with Phase 2 in alcohol use disorder launching in early 2027 and Phase 3 targeted for 2028. There is an important caveat here. The medical literature on nor-ibogaine's cardiac safety is mixed. A 2016 analysis in Clinical Toxicology found that nor-ibogaine may be at least as harmful to cardiac function as ibogaine itself because it stays in the body longer. DemeRx's trial will generate the data needed to resolve that question, but the FDA cleared the trial specifically because that question needs a rigorous answer. The IND clearance is the beginning of a scientific process, not the end of it. What is clear is that as of spring 2026, ibogaine has moved from a fringe discussion to simultaneous action at the state level, the federal level, and inside the FDA. That convergence has not happened with any other psychedelic compound.
Behind the legislation and the data, there are people for whom this is not a policy debate. Marcus Capone spent years as a Navy SEAL. When he left the military, he was dealing with the effects that tens of thousands of veterans carry home: PTSD, depression, and the kind of unresolvable suffering that standard psychiatric treatment rarely touches. He traveled to Mexico for ibogaine treatment at a private clinic. It changed his life. Capone and his wife Amber founded an organization called VETS Inc., Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions. Based in Dallas, VETS has funded Ibogaine treatment for approximately 1,300 former military personnel at a cost of roughly $10,000 per session. Every single one of those treatments happened in Mexico because the compound is not legally accessible in the United States. That detail matters. Right now, access to Ibogaine treatment requires money and a willingness to travel internationally. It is, in practice, available to veterans who can raise $10,000 and get on a plane. That access equation is precisely what the Texas program is trying to change. If the UT Health Houston and UTMB trials succeed, Ibogaine treatment could eventually be available in the clinical setting inside the United States, with insurance potentially covering at least part of the cost, in a facility with cardiac monitoring and properly trained staff. The Capone story illustrates both why this matters and why the current situation is not a solution. 1,300 people helped is meaningful. The opioid crisis claimed 75,000 lives last year alone.
Here's what the next 2 years are going to test. 30 veterans in a single Stanford study is compelling, but not enough to change prescribing standards. The Texas program is designed to generate the larger, controlled trial data the FDA requires. UT Health and UTMB will run real clinical trials with randomized controls and follow-up periods long enough to measure durability. The cardiac risk question is not closed. The magnesium protocol reduces it significantly, but the FDA will want that documented across hundreds of patients. DemeRx's Ibogaine derivative is a separate bet that a modified compound might sidestep the cardiac issue entirely. There is also a supply question. A company called Optimi Health, listed on the NASDAQ, is building pharmaceutical-grade Ibogaine manufacturing, developing standardized capsules for clinical use. The history of psychedelic medicine includes compounds whose development stalled because the supply chain was never built. Optimi is building it now. The most optimistic realistic timeline for a federally approved Ibogaine treatment is 2029 or 2030. A clean approval does not automatically mean insurance coverage or trained clinicians. Texas has created the conditions for Ibogaine to be properly studied. The political will is real. The federal support is real. The preliminary data is real. What we do not yet know is whether Ibogaine can survive the scrutiny of large-scale trials the way smaller studies suggest it will. If it does, a single treatment with durability measured in months or longer, applied to the leading cause of death in American adults under 45, would represent a category shift in how medicine thinks about addiction. For now, it is a $100 million bet, and Texas has placed it. If you found this useful, subscribe. We cover the science, the medicine, and the policy developments that actually matter. Coming up, more on the compounds reshaping psychiatry and what the evidence actually says about them. This video is for educational purposes only and is not medical advice. If you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, contact SAMHSA at 1-800-622-4357.